This is the story of September 11th, a day when ordinary lives were shattered in an instant and the world was changed forever. The skyline of New York was scarred, but the hearts of millions around the world carried an even deeper pain. Welcome to Fall Asleep Too. If long, gentle journeys through history, philosophy, and the stars bring you comfort, consider subscribing so you'll always have another story waiting. Now, get comfortable. Let the world grow quiet. No one should ever have to endure the horror and heartbreak of what happened on that day. It was a tragedy of unimaginable scale and a reminder of how fragile and precious life truly is. Let's begin. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, a sky as clear and blue as any autumn day hung over New York City. People commuted to work, children were being dropped off at school, and flights took off across the country as they had every day before. But by the end of the morning, nothing would be the same. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. At first, people thought it was an accident, a tragic, terrible mistake. A passenger plane hitting one of the tallest buildings in the world. It seemed surreal. Smoke billowed out of the building. Papers and debris rained down from above. The tower, which stood like a monument to modern architecture, was now burning. 17 minutes later, at 9:03 a.m., another plane, United Airlines Flight 175, struck the South Tower. At that moment, everything changed. The word accident disappeared from everyone's mind. This was deliberate. This was an attack. The confusion turned to horror and horror into panic. Across America and around the globe, television screens began to broadcast the events live. People watched in disbelief as the towers burned, as first responders rushed into danger, as office workers tried to escape the smoke and fire, some climbing down stairs for dozens of floors, others tragically trapped. And then, at 9:37 a.m., another plane, American Airlines Flight 77, crashed into the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia. The very symbol of American military power was now in flames. And still, it wasn't over. At 10:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 93 crashed into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. It was later revealed that passengers on board had learned of the other attacks and bravely attempted to retake the cockpit. Their actions, heroic and selfless, likely prevented another catastrophe, possibly targeting the White House or the Capitol. By 10:28 a.m., both towers of the World Trade Center had collapsed. Thousands of lives were lost. First responders, office workers, firefighters, police officers, mothers, fathers, sons, daughters. People from more than 90 countries died that day. The numbers were staggering, but they could never capture the true scale of the loss. In the moments after the towers fell, the world seemed to stand still. Dust clouds rose like tidal waves, rolling through the streets of Lower Manhattan. They engulfed everything: buildings, cars, people. A blizzard of ash and debris covered the ground, turning day into night. The people who emerged from it were ghostly figures, covered head to toe in grey soot, coughing, stunned, stumbling. There were cries for help, sirens blaring. Silence interrupted only by the distant wail of alarms and the unmistakable sound of grief. For those on the ground, survival was a matter of seconds. Many ran as the towers came down, ducking into shops, under cars, into subway entrances. Some were saved by chance, others by the quick actions of strangers. Stories would later emerge of office workers carrying disabled colleagues down dozens of flights of stairs, of firefighters who refused to leave until everyone they could reach had been guided out, of ordinary people transformed into heroes in an instant. These were moments of humanity amidst catastrophe, flickers of light in one of the darkest days in modern history. Back at home and around the globe, people watched in disbelief. Every major news network had turned to live coverage. The collapse of the towers, once symbols of global commerce, had been captured on camera, and the footage replayed endlessly. It was not just the loss of buildings or even lives. It was a deep psychological rupture. The idea that America, long seen as distant from the world's worst violence, could be attacked so directly and so violently, shattered a sense of safety that many had taken for granted. In Washington, D.C., chaos unfolded as smoke poured from the Pentagon. First responders rushed into the burning structure, pulling out the wounded, fighting the blaze, trying to contain the destruction. Military command centers were temporarily relocated. Fighter jets were scrambled into the skies. All civilian aircraft across the United States were ordered to land immediately. Air traffic controllers executed the unprecedented task of grounding every flight. The skies, once crisscrossed with thousands of planes, went eerily silent. Flight 93, the last of the 4 hijacked planes, was brought down not by attackers, but by courage. When passengers learned through phone calls and whispers of the other planes and the chaos unfolding below, they made a decision. In the face of certain death, they chose to resist. They gathered makeshift weapons, said goodbye to their loved ones over the phone, and stormed the cockpit. The plane crashed into an empty field in Pennsylvania, a scar on the earth that now stands as a symbol of bravery. The passengers of Flight 93, though they perished, likely saved hundreds more. In the hours that followed, a flood of confusion and fear spread across the nation. No one knew if more attacks were coming. Government buildings were evacuated, borders tightened, major cities went on high alert. For many Americans, the threat felt not just real, but immediate and everywhere. Parents rushed to schools to pick up their children. Office buildings closed. Public transit systems shut down. Across the country, people gathered around televisions and radios, trying to make sense of what had just happened. President George W. Bush, who had been visiting an elementary school in Florida when the first plane struck, was quickly ushered to safety. His face, captured on camera as he was informed of the second plane, became one of the day's most replayed moments. That evening, he addressed the nation from the Oval Office. With a somber voice and resolute tone, he declared that America had been attacked with deliberate evil and that those responsible would be brought to justice. It was a promise that would define the next decades of American foreign policy. But in the immediate aftermath, the focus was not yet on war or retaliation. It was on survival, rescue, and grief. At Ground Zero, what had once been 2 soaring towers was now a smouldering pile of rubble, twisted steel, and broken lives. The site, still hot from the fires, was dubbed the Pile by first responders. Rescue workers from across the country rushed to New York. Firefighters, police, EMTs, construction workers, volunteers, all came to help dig through the debris, searching desperately for survivors. Some were found, trapped for hours or even days beneath the wreckage, but as time passed, those miracles grew fewer. The work shifted from rescue to recovery. New York became a city united in sorrow. Strangers embraced on the streets. People stood in long lines to donate blood, not yet knowing that there would be few survivors to need it. Missing persons posters covered every wall and lamppost. Thousands of families clung to hope, waiting for news, sometimes for weeks. Candlelight vigils were held in every borough. The city, bruised and battered, mourned collectively. And quietly, it resolved to endure. For the families of the victims, time blurred. The hours after the attacks stretched into days of waiting, then weeks of mourning, then months of trying to carry on. More than 2,900 people had died, not just in New York, but also at the Pentagon and in that quiet field in Pennsylvania. Each name represented a life, a story, a family, a set of dreams and plans that would never be fulfilled. The scale of the loss was enormous, but the pain was always personal. Funerals became daily events. Flags were lowered across the nation. Memorials sprang up, not just official ones, but improvised tributes of flowers, candles, letters, and photos. The scent of smoke lingered in Lower Manhattan for weeks, a constant, inescapable reminder of what had happened. The nation was grieving together, even as each individual grief was its own unique weight. And yet, amid the tragedy, there was also unity. Political divides seemed, for a brief moment, to fade. A sense of shared purpose and collective identity surged. People spoke of being one nation, of resilience, of coming together. The heroism of first responders became a national touchstone. Firefighters and police officers were no longer just local public servants. They were symbols of bravery, sacrifice, and service. That week, Congress gathered on the steps of the Capitol and sang, "God Bless America." Sports events paused, and when they resumed, they did so with moments of silence and patriotic tributes. The phrase, "never forget," became a rallying cry, a promise both to honour those lost and to ensure that something like this would never happen again. As the fires smouldered and the rubble cooled, a haunting silence settled over Ground Zero. It was not just the silence of a city in mourning, but the silence of uncertainty, of a world forced to reckon with something it could not yet fully understand. Investigations began almost immediately. Who had done this? How had it happened? And most urgently, could it happen again? Within days, attention turned to a name that was already familiar to intelligence agencies, Osama bin Laden. A Saudi national and leader of the terrorist group al-Qaeda, bin Laden had long declared his hostility toward the United States. Now, evidence began to surface linking the attacks to his organization, intercepted communications, ties between the hijackers, and years of intelligence reports that had warned of a possible plot. The hijackers themselves, 19 men, most of them from Saudi Arabia, had trained in the US, lived quietly among everyday Americans, and coordinated with deadly precision. The attack had been meticulously planned. Flights were chosen based on their fuel loads and cross-country routes. Cockpit doors were breached with speed. Passengers were overpowered with box cutters, a chilling reminder of how simple tools could be turned into instruments of mass destruction. Investigators traced the hijackers' movements across cities like Boston, Newark, and Washington, D.C., hotel stays, flight schools, purchases. They had walked among the very people whose lives they would one day help destroy. As these connections were uncovered, the mood of the country shifted. Shock and grief began to mix with anger. There was a hunger for justice, for accountability, and so began what would come to be known as the War on Terror. On October 7th, 2001, less than a month after the attacks, the United States launched airstrikes in Afghanistan. The target, the Taliban, the extremist regime that had given safe haven to bin Laden and al-Qaeda. Troops followed. What began as a mission to dismantle terrorist networks quickly expanded. In the months and years that followed, thousands of American service members deployed to the mountains and deserts of Afghanistan. They pursued militants, trained local forces, built schools, and tried to stabilize a deeply complex region. The war would go on to become the longest in American history, Back at home, the attacks transformed the American psyche and society. Airports changed overnight. What had once been a quick walk to the gate became a series of security checkpoints, X-rays, pat-downs and full-body scans. Shoes came off, bottled water was banned, flight crews were trained in new protocols. The Department of Homeland Security was created, merging 22 federal agencies under one roof. Intelligence sharing, border enforcement, emergency response, all were reorganized in the name of national security. The Patriot Act was passed, granting expanded surveillance powers to law enforcement. Phone records were collected, emails were scanned. For many, this new vigilance was necessary, even comforting. For others, it marked the beginning of a long and uneasy trade-off between safety and privacy. The question hung in the air: how much freedom should be given up in the name of protection? New York, too, began to transform. The site where the towers had once stood was cleared painstakingly, piece by piece. It took months to remove all the debris. Families waited for remains to be identified, some waiting years. Out of the wreckage, a vision began to take shape. Not to replace what was lost, but to honour it. Plans were drawn for a memorial. Twin reflecting pools would be built in the footprints of the towers, their waters falling endlessly into the earth. Around them, the names of the victims would be engraved in bronze, each one a life remembered. In 2006, the Freedom Tower, later renamed One World Trade Center, began construction. Rising slowly into the sky, it would become the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere. A new skyline was forming, born not out of defiance, but resilience. It was not just architecture. It was memory, cast in steel and glass. But memory is not built in stone alone. It lives in the quiet moments, the tolling of bells each September 11th, the reading of names at the Memorial Plaza, the small gestures of remembrance that echo through the years. School children now learn about that day not from the news, but from textbooks. A generation has grown up in the shadow of 9/11, shaped by its aftermath, yet without the memory of the day itself. The ripple effects of the attack were global. Countries around the world strengthened their counter-terrorism efforts. Alliances shifted. Military strategies evolved. For some regions, the war on terror brought hope for liberation. For others, it brought drone strikes, displacement, and unintended consequences. In Iraq, where the US invaded in 2003 citing weapons of mass destruction and links to terrorism, claims later discredited. Another long and bloody conflict unfolded. The Middle East became a chessboard of shifting power, insurgency, and civil strife. At home, American Muslims faced a different burden, as investigators confirmed that the attackers were radical Islamists. Waves of fear and suspicion swept across the country. Hate crimes increased. Mosques were vandalized. Innocent people were harassed, profiled, and discriminated against. A religion practiced by over 1 billion people worldwide, most of them peaceful, was often reduced to the actions of a few extremists. The attack, meant to divide, found tragic echoes in the ways people turned on one another. And yet, for all its horror, 9/11 also sparked moments of great compassion. Blood donation drives overflowed. Rescue dogs and their handlers arrived from around the world. Volunteers cooked meals for workers. At Ground Zero, artists responded with music, paintings, poetry. Strangers held hands in the streets. A shared grief became, in many ways, a shared purpose. For many survivors and first responders, though, the battle continued long after the dust settled. Exposure to toxins at Ground Zero led to long-term health problems, respiratory illnesses, cancers, psychological trauma. The air, they were told at the time, was safe to breathe. That, sadly, turned out to be false. Decades later, thousands of these heroes would fight a second battle, for recognition, for healthcare, for justice. In 2011, nearly 10 years to the day after the attacks, that justice seemed finally within reach. US Navy SEALs raided a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. Their target was Osama bin Laden. After a brief firefight, he was killed. News of his death spread quickly. Crowds gathered outside the White House and in Times Square. Some cheered, others wept. It was not a celebration of death, but a release of tension, a moment of closure for a wound that had remained open for a decade. Still, the legacy of 9/11 continued to unfold. Policies born in the days after the attacks remained in place. Wars that began in response stretched across generations. Surveillance, immigration, security all became lasting points of debate. The country had been changed, not just in its skyline, but in its soul. As time passed, the sharp pain of September 11th began to soften, not into forgetfulness, but into remembrance. The images from that day remained etched in the national consciousness. The towers burning against a blue sky, the fireball erupting from the second impact, the people running through the streets coated in ash, fleeing from falling steel. They became symbols, not just of loss, but of resilience. Each anniversary was marked with solemnity. Bells tolled at the exact moments the planes struck. Families gathered to read the names of the lost, some trembling, others resolute. Children who had been too young to remember the day stood beside photos of parents they never knew. The world watched, year after year, as a nation paused to remember not just what was taken, but how it had endured. And yet, even as time moved forward, the legacy of 9/11 deepened in complexity. What had started as a singular moment of national unity eventually gave way to harder questions about the balance between freedom and security, about the human cost of war, about the responsibility of remembering truthfully. These weren't just policy debates or academic questions. They were deeply personal for millions. For the people of Afghanistan and Iraq, 9/11 was not only a memory, but a beginning, the starting point of decades of foreign occupation, shifting governments, drone strikes, and violent insurgencies. Civilian casualties mounted, refugee crises grew. In many places, the hope that followed the fall of regimes was replaced by power vacuums, extremism, and instability. The war on terror expanded, touching Libya, Yemen, Syria, and beyond. And in its wake, new threats emerged, some born of the very instability the war had hoped to quell. Meanwhile, for those who had lived through the attacks, survivors, witnesses, first responders, the trauma lingered. Some could not sleep in high-rise buildings. Others avoided airplanes for years. The sound of a low-flying jet, the unexpected blare of a siren. Even decades later, these could trigger waves of panic. PTSD, survivors' guilt, and chronic illness were silent shadows that followed many long after the dust had cleared. The children of 9/11 grew up in a world shaped by it. Some were born that very day, their lives forever linked to tragedy. Others lost parents, siblings, relatives. For them, the event was not history, it was inheritance, and yet they carried it with grace. Many would go on to become storytellers, teachers, advocates, firefighters, nurses. They chose to honor the memory of those they lost by living lives of quiet strength. The memorials, too, evolved. In New York, the 9/11 Memorial and Museum opened to the public. Visitors walked past twisted steel beams, recovered artifacts, and powerful testimonies from survivors and families. The reflecting pools, deep and serene, invited moments of silence in the middle of a bustling city. The sound of water cascading into the voids echoed the collective grief of a generation. People came from around the world to stand in the footprints of the towers, to place flowers beside the names, to say nothing at all. But 9/11's story isn't just about that one day. It's about everything it changed, both immediately and slowly over time. It's about how governments shifted, how people redefined safety, how airports became places of both hope and anxiety. It's about the soldiers who served in foreign deserts and the families who waited for them at home. It's about how an entire generation learned to live with both fear and courage. The cultural memory of 9/11 also wove its way into film, literature, art, and music. Poets wrote of ash and absence. Painters used grey palettes, swirling with grief and fire. Novels explored the psychic wound left behind, and documentaries tried to capture the magnitude of loss. For some, these works helped make sense of the senseless. For others, they were reminders that pain shared is pain lessened, that art, even when born from tragedy, can be a form of healing. As the 20th anniversary approached, a new chapter began. In August 2021, after nearly 2 decades, American troops withdrew from Afghanistan. The war, which had started in the wake of 9/11, had finally ended. But the withdrawal itself was chaotic and painful. Kabul fell to the Taliban in a matter of days. Evacuation scenes at the airport, people clinging to departing planes, desperate crowds, last-minute flights, brought a complex mix of emotions: relief, anger, sorrow, reflection. Some questioned what it had all been for. Others saw it as the inevitable end of an impossible mission. And yet, within that uncertainty, something else became clear: the importance of remembering. Not just the facts, but the feelings. Not just the losses, but the acts of bravery. Not just the destruction, but the rebuilding. 9/11 was not just a moment in time. It was a transformation. It shaped policy, yes, but it also shaped people. It taught a new generation the cost of complacency, the fragility of peace, and the unexpected strength of everyday people. In schools around the world, young students now learn about September 11th as history. They study the events, the causes, the aftermath. They read eyewitness accounts, watch archival footage, ask thoughtful questions. For many, the idea that such horror could unfold on an ordinary morning seems impossible. But through education, careful, compassionate education, the memory lives on. Not as fear, but as awareness. Not as vengeance, but as a plea for understanding. And still, every year, the sun rises over Manhattan on September 11th. And for a moment, the city slows. Names are read, bells are rung, tears fall, and somewhere, in a classroom or a living room or a quiet corner of a memorial, someone pauses to reflect and remembers that before it was history, it was life. Lives lived and lost. Families broken and made stronger. A day when the world stood still and then somehow kept going. In the years that followed, America, and much of the world, settled into a new kind of normal. It was not the same as before, not in tone, not in temperament. There was a subtle undercurrent of vigilance, an awareness that safety could never again be taken for granted. This shift wasn't always visible, but it coloured daily life. It was felt in the long security lines at airports, in the quietly observed moments of silence at football games, in the nervous glance people gave when they heard a loud noise in a crowded space. The world had become more cautious, and in some ways more connected. The internet was still in its early stages in 2001, but the years after 9/11 saw an explosion of digital growth. People wanted to know, to share, to understand. Online communities began to blossom around topics of remembrance, support, and dialogue. For those who lost loved ones in the attacks, the internet became a place to preserve memories. Digital tributes, online memorial walls, virtual candles that flickered on screens across the globe. But the digital era also brought with it confusion, misinformation, conspiracy theories. Some people, unwilling or unable to accept the reality of such a massive tragedy, began to weave alternative narratives. These ideas found traction in obscure corners of the internet, eventually spilling into the mainstream. For survivors and the families of victims, this was a painful echo, a denial of their truth, of their grief, of the weight they carried every day. But still, they endured. Organizations formed to provide support, to educate, and to advocate for those most affected. The September 11th Victim Compensation Fund was established and later expanded to provide financial assistance to families and first responders suffering from long-term health issues. Advocacy groups like the Feel Good Foundation emerged to fight for healthcare access for rescue workers and survivors. Celebrities, politicians, and everyday citizens joined in. One of the most vocal advocates, comedian Jon Stewart, used his platform to bring attention to the continuing struggles of those who ran toward danger while others fled. Their work was not easy. It required years of lobbying, testimony, and public pressure. But eventually, legislation was passed to provide ongoing healthcare funding for those still sick from the toxins they had breathed in the aftermath. It was a small measure of justice, hard-won and long overdue. And still, the personal stories kept coming. A woman who had escaped from the 77th floor of the South Tower later became a therapist, helping others cope with trauma. A firefighter who had lost his entire unit returned to the force and became a chaplain. A child who had been in preschool when their father was killed grew up to become a public speaker, telling their story in high schools and universities to help new generations understand what that day truly meant. The passage of time did not erase the sorrow, but it softened the sharpest edges. It allowed for healing, not complete, but meaningful. And with healing came reflection. Writers, historians, and artists began to ask broader questions. What did September 11th mean for the world? How had it changed the course of nations? What did it reveal about humanity? About our fear, our resilience, our capacity for hate, and our greater capacity for love? Museums opened exhibits dedicated to the event. Teachers crafted lesson plans. Survivors shared their stories with humility and grace. These were not just stories of what happened, but stories of how people responded, not only in the moment, but in the long arc of time that followed. How communities rallied, how strangers became lifelines, how the worst brought out, in some cases, the very best in people. Yet the echoes of 9/11 reverberated in ways that weren't always visible. Mental health, once a taboo topic in many communities, began to enter the public conversation. Post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, survivor's guilt. These terms became part of everyday vocabulary. There was a growing understanding that trauma wasn't always something you could see. Sometimes it lived quietly inside a person, shaping their world from the inside out. In film and television, depictions of 9/11 evolved. At first, there was hesitation, a respectful distance. But slowly, filmmakers began to explore the human stories within the tragedy, not the politics or the explosions, but the emotions. The family breakfasts left uneaten. The phone calls made from hijacked planes. The voicemails that families saved for years, replaying the final words of loved ones just to hear their voice again. These were the quiet truths that defined the day, far more than any headline ever could. And yet, the world continued to move. children born in 2001 began entering adulthood. Many had no memory of that day, yet their lives had been shaped by it nonetheless. They grew up in an era of heightened security, increased surveillance, and a national consciousness that had been forever altered. For them, September 11th was not a memory, but a framework, a lens through which they understood global conflict, civic responsibility, and the weight of history. Internationally, the global landscape had also changed. Nations strengthened alliances. Intelligence sharing between countries became more robust. Emergency response systems were upgraded. But at the same time, a new wave of nationalism, suspicion, and fear spread. In some places, the memory of 9/11 was used not just for unity, but for division, to justify policies that targeted immigrants, religious minorities, or political dissenters. It was a reminder that memory is powerful, but it must be handled with care. And so, each year, on the anniversary of the attacks, the nation remembered, not in loud parades or triumphant speeches, but in quiet gatherings, church bells, candlelight, the sound of names being spoken slowly and deliberately. For those listening, it was a reminder that behind every name was a story, behind every story a life, and behind every life a web of connection that still stretched across time, linking the past to the present. The story of 9/11 is, at its core, not only a story of loss, it is also a story of resilience, of rebuilding, of remembering, of choosing again and again to move forward without forgetting what came before. In Lower Manhattan, where twisted metal once lay in a jagged heap, new glass towers rose. The skyline that had been pierced by terror was slowly reimagined, reshaped not by vengeance, but by vision. One World Trade Center, gleaming in the daylight and glowing softly at night, became more than just a building. It became a symbol, not of erasure, but of endurance. Its spire, reaching 1,776 feet into the sky, was not just a measurement of height, but a quiet nod to the year of America's founding, a tribute to what had been and to what could still be. Beside it, the 9/11 memorial pools offer something quieter, deeper, more intimate. As water cascades endlessly into the twin voids where the towers once stood, it creates a sound that is both soothing and sorrowful. Visitors run their fingers across the names carved in bronze. Some bring flowers, others simply stand in silence. The space is not loud or dramatic. It is reflective, intentional, and sacred. And just beneath it, the 9/11 Museum houses more than exhibits. It holds memory. It preserves the final phone calls of loved ones, the shoes of evacuees, the last notes written by hand and passed from one person to another in a stairwell. It displays the surviving tridents from the North Tower's base, bent but unbroken, standing as they once did, strong and silent. For many who visit, it is not the scale of the tragedy that overwhelms. It's the humanity. The story of 9/11, in the years that followed, became woven into the fabric of American identity. It lived in flags hanging from porches, in bumper stickers that read "Never Forget," in the firehouse murals painted in neighborhoods where entire crews had been lost. It shaped a generation of children who would grow up to become soldiers, nurses, journalists, public servants, many of them inspired by the courage they saw on that day. That inspiration took many forms. Some young people enlisted, hoping to serve their country in the fight against terrorism. Others became lawyers or teachers, determined to promote justice and understanding. Still others became advocates for peace, working in global diplomacy and humanitarian aid. In a way, Every action taken with a sense of purpose and compassion in the years after 9/11 became part of the legacy of those who were lost. But legacies are not fixed things. They evolve, stretch, and are shaped by those who carry them. As new generations inherit the story of 9/11, the responsibility shifts from those who remember the day to those who must understand it and ensure that its lessons endure. And this understanding doesn't come only from facts and timelines, but from empathy, from listening, from honoring the full complexity of the event, not just what happened, but why and what came after. In classrooms across the world, teachers now introduce the topic carefully, not with fear, but with care. Students are shown images, yes, but more importantly, they are told stories of bravery, of unity, of sacrifice. They learn not just about what was destroyed, but what was built in the wake of destruction, and in that, they find meaning. For survivors, remembering is a daily act. For some, it's in the photograph they keep by the bed. For others, it's in the volunteer work they do in a community centre, or in the stories they share with their grandchildren. Some survivors find peace in speaking publicly. Others choose silence, carrying their memories like folded letters kept in a pocket, always close, rarely opened, but never discarded. The city of New York itself became a living testament. Tourists flocked to the memorial site, but locals remember the smaller things, the resilience of subway conductors who kept trains moving, of street vendors who returned days later to their regular corners, of communities that organised meals for firefighters, vigils for neighbours, and support groups for the grieving. Even in its sorrow, the city never stopped being what it was, a place of movement, of energy, of stories intersecting. And perhaps that is what made the attacks so devastating. They struck at a symbol of modern life, of connection, of possibility. But perhaps that is also what made the recovery so profound, because that spirit, while bruised, was never broken. Grief, too, transformed over time. What began as raw, unbearable pain slowly settled into something quieter, a steady ache, a thread woven into daily life. For some, healing came in the form of activism. For others, in the simple act of planting a tree or lighting a candle each year. For many, it came from knowing they were not alone, that millions grieved with them, even if they'd never met. And in that shared grief, a global community emerged. Around the world, countries honoured the victims. Monuments were built in Canada, in Israel, in London, in Rome. People lit candles in towns and cities thousands of miles from New York, from Washington, from Shanksville. They did so not just in solidarity, but in recognition that the pain of that day rippled outward, touching humanity itself. The attack had been meant to divide, to instill fear, to weaken. But what it revealed instead was how deeply connected people are. In the days after 9/11, political ideologies faded, cultural differences softened, strangers helped strangers, faith groups opened their doors to those of different beliefs. The world mourned, together. In the quiet corners of post-9/11 history, far from the headlines and ceremonies, there are stories that often go untold. Small, intimate moments that, when gathered together, form the deeper heartbeat of this event. These are the stories of people who weren't in the towers or on the planes or at the Pentagon, but who were still shaped irrevocably by what happened. There's the child who grew up hearing only fragments of who their parent was, a photograph on the wall, a voicemail saved for years, a few worn-down stories repeated gently by grieving grandparents. For them, 9/11 is not a memory, but a mystery they spend a lifetime unravelling. Every piece of information is precious. A school project becomes a chance to know more, a documentary, a new thread. They carry the loss as part of their identity, like a quiet surname no one else can hear. There's the immigrant store owner who, in the weeks after the attack, felt fearful just stepping outside. Though he loved the country that had given him opportunity, he found himself viewed with suspicion. Some nights, he closed early. Other days, he posted signs in his window. "We stand with America. God bless the victims." His patriotism was not performative. It was protective. It was survival. And there's the teacher who, on the morning of September 12th, had to stand in front of a classroom full of confused and frightened children. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know why or how something so terrible had happened. But she read them a story. She let them ask questions. She listened. And in her listening, she planted a seed of empathy that those students would carry with them long after they left her class. These small, unassuming stories form the connective tissue between the event itself and the world that followed. For while the footage of the towers falling is what many remember, it's in these quiet, human-scale moments that we find the true legacy of 9/11. Because what was attacked that day was more than just buildings or systems. It was the belief that ordinary life, mundane, imperfect, bustling, and beautiful, could unfold safely. And what was defended in the hours and days that followed was exactly that. The idea that even in the face of profound loss, people could hold each other up. The first responders who kept digging long after hope had faded. The therapists who worked with traumatized families free of charge. The strangers who formed lines to give blood, not knowing that most of it would go unused, not because it wasn't needed, but because there were so few survivors. There's something unspeakably humbling in that realization, that the horror was so complete, and yet people still showed up. People still hoped. And then there are those who survived the attacks, who made it out of the towers, or narrowly missed a flight, or were late to work that day and spent the rest of their lives wondering why. Why was I spared? Why did I live? Survivor's guilt is a quiet and corrosive grief, and for many it was the defining emotional inheritance of that day. But some turned that guilt into purpose. They became advocates for peace, spoke in schools, wrote books, created foundations. Others simply chose to live more fully, to cherish each ordinary day as something extraordinary, because they had glimpsed the alternative, and it had changed them forever. The aftermath of 9/11 reshaped not only policy and politics, but also how people thought about time, about impermanence, about what it means to say goodbye without warning. Many families now said, "I love you" before leaving the house, even if they were just going around the corner. Many workers no longer took their routines for granted. A cup of coffee, a morning commute, the view from an office window, all became, in some quiet way, sacred. There's also the broader impact on American consciousness, how the event shifted the very tone of the country. Prior to 2001, there was a kind of cultural optimism in the air, a belief in progress, in globalization, in endless upward motion. The internet was expanding, the economy was booming, and while problems existed, they felt solvable. After September 11th, that optimism changed. It didn't disappear entirely, but it became more cautious, more fragile. The sense that the future was guaranteed dissolved. It became clear that the world could change in a single morning, without warning, that even a beautiful day, a blue sky day, could hold something devastating just beyond the horizon. This was a loss of innocence, not just for a nation, but for a generation. But there's power in that kind of reckoning. It strips away illusion and brings clarity. It forces people to ask deeper questions. What really matters? Who do I love? What do I want to leave behind? And how do I honour the lives of those lost? not only with memorials, but with choices, that in many ways is the enduring challenge of 9/11. Not just to remember, but to carry forward the lessons. To build a world that is more compassionate, more attentive, more aware. A world where grief is not something to be silenced or pushed aside, but something to be tended to, gently, like a garden. A place where pain can become meaning, and where meaning can lead to change. In the soft silence that follows a tragedy, there is often a temptation to move on, to turn the page, to resume life as it was. But when an event like 9/11 reshapes the contours of a nation's soul, moving on isn't so simple. The wounds may close, but the scars remain. And those scars are not merely reminders of pain, they are evidence of survival. 2 decades after the towers fell, their absence is still felt in subtle ways. In the way the skyline of Manhattan catches the morning light. In the way news anchors pause when September approaches. In the way even the youngest Americans, those born long after the attacks, still know the phrase 9/11 as something sacred, something heavy, something different. It's become more than a date. It's become a cultural landmark, a pivot point. There's a generation now often called the 9/11 generation. They were children at the time, maybe 5, maybe 10, maybe sitting in a classroom when the news broke, their teachers trying to shield them from the terror while processing their own shock. They grew up in the shadow of heightened security, of orange and red threat levels, of news reports filled with words like terror alert, intelligence briefing, and ground zero. These were the kids who saw airport lines double, who watched their parents cry during presidential speeches, who carried backpacks through metal detectors. Many came of age during wartime, during political polarization, during moments when fear became a background noise, not overwhelming, but ever present. And yet, they also grew up seeing heroism, not just in the firefighters and police officers honored in ceremonies, but in everyday people. The bus driver who took a detour to drop off frightened commuters, the nurse who worked double shifts for weeks, the friend who quietly held space for someone else's grief. These were not movie moments. They were real, and they left their mark. The post-9/11 world was also a world in which unity was possible, at least for a moment. For those first few days and weeks, political party lines blurred. Faith communities held interreligious services. Neighbours helped neighbours. And there was a shared recognition that beneath all the differences, race, class, religion, politics, there was something more fundamental, the simple, sacred fact of being human. But like all things, that unity was tested. As years passed, debates intensified about foreign policy, about surveillance, about how to properly remember, about how to teach the next generation. The national consensus that had felt unbreakable in September of 2001 began to fray. Not because people stopped caring, but because the questions became harder, the answers more complex. How do you teach children about 9/11 without also explaining the wars that followed, the civilian casualties, the controversies over torture, rendition, and drone strikes? How do you honour the lives lost without ignoring the lives forever changed by the policies that came in its wake? These were questions that had no simple answer, and yet they had to be asked. Artists and authors helped bridge that gap. They created novels that explored the emotional aftermath, films that focused not on the politics, but on the human cost, paintings that captured the silence of the empty sky, songs that gave voice to the things too painful to say aloud. Through art, people found new ways to process and to pass on the experience of 9/11. For many Americans, the pain remains intensely personal, a specific face, a specific name, a voicemail, a uniform, a final breakfast left half eaten. But for others, especially those who weren't directly touched, the story of 9/11 has become part of a broader collective memory. It's woven into the country's identity, not just as a moment of terror, but as a call to remember who we are at our best: compassionate, united, courageous. That call shows up in quiet ways. In the communities that hold food drives every September in memory of those lost. In the small towns that still lower their flags, even without formal ceremonies. In the classrooms where students now lead the moment of silence themselves, having inherited the story and chosen to carry it forward. Abroad too, the memory echoes. In countries that stood with America in the aftermath. In military families across the globe who also bore the cost of the wars that followed. In places where ordinary people watched the towers fall and wept even though they had never set foot in New York. Because some losses transcend borders. Some events remind us that, at our core, we are all more alike than different. And in this remembrance, something else takes root. Responsibility. The responsibility not just to mourn, but to learn. Not just to remember the tragedy, but to understand its consequences. Not just to honour the fallen, but to live more deeply, with gratitude, with empathy, with purpose. As the years pass, memory matures. It deepens. It no longer startles with the same intensity, but instead returns in quiet, steady ways, like the sound of waves, rhythmic and soft, always there beneath the surface of everyday life. That's what 9/11 has become for many people now. Not just a day frozen in time, but a quiet undercurrent in their worldview. A reminder that life is fragile, that ordinary days can be extraordinary in both beauty and loss, that we must not take for granted the slow mornings, the shared coffees, the unspoken goodbyes, because history shows us how quickly those moments can vanish. In many ways, September 11th is now held gently, not only in the national calendar, but in the personal rituals of those who remember. A mother lights a candle each year in her kitchen, her eyes lingering on the flame longer than usual. A father touches the name of a friend etched in bronze, not to mourn again, but to say, "You're still here with me." A firefighter who survived chooses to walk alone to the site each year, not because he must, but because it is his way of giving thanks for another day. And there is something profound in that. In the personal rituals, the small gestures, they tell us that remembrance does not have to be grand to be real. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is invisible. Sometimes it is the simple act of living well. There are memorials, of course, large and solemn. They stand in New York, in Washington, in Pennsylvania. But the true memorials live in the lives of the people who carry the memory forward, in the decisions they make, in the kindness they show, in the resilience they embody. And resilience, in this context, is not just about rebuilding buildings or catching enemies. It's about emotional endurance, the kind that allows people to get up again, even when their world has crumbled, the kind that lets them hold their grief and their hope in the same hand, that lets them love again, trust again, and try again. The survivors of 9/11, those who were inside the buildings, those who watched from the streets, those who answered the call to rescue, they are not defined by their suffering. They are defined by what they did next. Some returned to work. Others became advocates. Some struggled silently for years before speaking out. Each path is different, and each is valid. In the generations that follow, remembrance evolves. The stories will be retold by people who weren't there. Children, grandchildren, students. They will say the words with reverence, but also with a certain distance. And that's okay. That's how history works. We do not carry the pain of our ancestors exactly as they did, but we carry its meaning, and that is enough. To never forget doesn't mean to relive the trauma endlessly. It means to protect the lessons it taught, to remember what fear can do and what love can do in response, to remember the silence of the sky and the roar of community rising in its place, to remember not only who we lost, but who we became in the process. It means creating a world where that kind of pain is less likely to happen again, not just through security and policy, but through understanding and compassion, through listening, through recognizing the humanity in one another before hatred ever has a chance to grow. And that's perhaps the most enduring challenge of all, not just to remember what happened, but to ensure that our remembrance builds something better. And now, as our story gently comes to a close, we return to the stillness, to the quiet that followed the chaos, to the silence that speaks louder than any words. September 11th, 2001 was a day of unimaginable loss. But it was also a day of unimaginable courage, in stairwells, in cockpits, in smoky corridors, and tearful phone calls. People chose bravery. People chose love. We remember them not only because they were taken, but because they gave us something lasting, a reminder of what matters most. The people we love. The ordinary moments we too often overlook. The strength we find in one another when everything else falls away. Let us carry that forward, not in fear, but in compassion, not in bitterness, but in memory, not in silence, but in gentleness. Thank you for taking this quiet journey through history. Rest well. You are safe.